Good afternoon and welcome to the College of Continuing and Professional Studies webinar, Critical Thinking, Making Decisions That Stick. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you here this afternoon. My name is Shanta Bulai and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. If you have future questions about the webinar or other programs we offer, the college's contact information will be on the last slide of this presentation. I'm delighted to introduce the topic for today's webinar, Critical Thinking, Making Decisions That Stick. Two of the most sought after workplace skills are critical thinking and decision making. We all know smart people, including ourselves, who make decisions that don't work out. Who doesn't want to be better equipped to confidently tackle decisions while creating the optimal conditions for successful implementation of these decisions? Join us to explore how critical thinking can get derailed and what you might do differently to keep it on track and apply new ways of thinking to make better decisions. In this webinar, we'll rethink your definition of critical thinking, understand why people come to different conclusions and what to do about it, appreciate the role of transparency in decision-making and how to build it, and avoid common decision-making pitfalls. It's a pleasure to introduce the presenter for today's webinar, Nan Gesche. Nan has over 20 years experience rooting out where things go wrong and helping them go right. As an educator, speaker, and coach whose passion is to help people play well together, she guides organizations and individuals through transition without losing sight of their strategic goals. Again, it's an honor to have you here, Nan, and thank you so much for being with us and sharing your wisdom on this topic. I'll pass it over to you.
Great, thank you, Shanta. Yes, happy and thrilled to be here. I love that, it's like 20 plus. Well, that means we're getting old, so maybe that's where the wisdom comes from, hopefully. Thank you for showing up today. Today, we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about decision making and how to think critically. Now, we all know life is full of decisions, big decisions, small decisions, significant, insignificant. And really lately, there just seems like there's so much uncertainty that even making decisions feels really difficult. We're afraid of the consequences. Sometimes we don't think we have enough information. And the truth is we never will. I used to work for an international consulting firm. And one of the things they often told us is that it's more important to have a timely decision than a perfect decision, because we can always change our minds and shift. The tricky part is, though, sometimes we're afraid of making decisions because we don't always trust ourselves to think critically. We have a difficult time sometimes trying to figure out how we balance both emotions and rationality. And so today we're going to talk about how we find that balance. And we're going to do that by starting actually with a story. So I'm going to give you a very personal story, and I'm going to take this slide down, and because I know it sometimes makes people uncomfortable. So instead, you get to watch me tell you about the story. And so the story is that my definition of critical thinking was forever changed over 10 years ago. What happened is that my father died when I was he died when I was 8 years old. He was about 45 years old. And at about that same age, I started having significant headaches. And so I went to my doctor and he's like, maybe we should do an MRI, do a scan, and, make sure that you also don't have brain aneurysms. And I'm like, great, at least I'll have proof that my brain's not empty. So I'm like, perfect. So I get the phone call, and yes, unfortunately, I do have brain aneurysms. So the decision was made to treat the brain aneurysms, two of the three, because one of them was pretty small and it's called an infundibulum, and it really won't have a huge impact if the aneurysm ruptures. So basically, aneurysm is a weak blood vessel. It's like a balloon. If it has a weak spot, it will rupture. So the one, they went in and they clipped and coiled and treated it. But the third brain aneurysm sits right where my brain stem splits. Okay. And so the surgeon, we had a lot of conversations, talked about it, and made the decision to go ahead and do the surgery. Funny thing was, though, he calls me the night before the surgery. Like, my surgeon had never called me, never had a conversation without his nurse in the room. And he's like, Nan, I don't know why, but something in my gut just feels off. I've called my friends at the Mayo, I've called my friends at the Barrow Institute, and I can't tell you what's really changed, but something just feels off. And then he went on to say, he said, when you were telling me about, why you were here and why you were interested in surgery, he says, the most important thing in your life is your kids, and that you wanted to be there for your kids in a way that your father wasn't there for you. So he said, I'm not sure about this, but if you want to have the surgery, we can go ahead. I'm like, well, if you're not feeling it, I'm not feeling it. Had he had his scheduler call and say his horoscope was off for the day, that might've been a different deal. But this experience changed my definition of thinking critically, because it told me that thinking critically isn't just about this. It's not just about your head. It was also about his gut. And it was also about his heart, because he listened to my story and what was important to me. Okay. But it also demonstrated that he was open-minded. He was willing to change his mind, even though we had made a decision. And from an intellectual brain perspective, it was a big decision. He made a decision not to do surgery, not even 12 hours, well, it was about 12 hours later when I had to be at the hospital. And he made a business decision that was going to impact a number of other people. Okay. He thought with 3 different parts of himself, and he was open-minded. But we're going to explore that further. Okay. Because most of us don't think of critical thinking the same way. So I'm going to take you maybe back to a more traditional definition, maybe then, of critical thinking, in that, that we often do think about, it's all about collecting information, okay? It's about collecting information from experiences, observation, reflection, and then figuring out what do we do with all that information, okay? And so what I have found working with groups is that the most effective critical thinkers and decision makers use structured processes. And we're going to talk some about structured processes today. And I talk about structured processes when I teach the critical thinking course through CCAPS. Besides the structured processes, though, on how to think critically, there are some basic prerequisites I think all of us need to think critically. And one of those is that we need input from others. And I'll speak more to that. I had just mentioned the need to be open-minded. We have to be physically in a good space. It's actually good to daydream, research is proving. And I'm going to talk about the 3 brains that I just talked about a minute ago. Okay. Now, when we are trying to think critically, we do need to get input from others. I often say that critical thinking is a team sport, because we all have biases, blind spots, things like that, that keep us from thinking as critically as we could. So as I said, I think of it as a team sport. So one of the things we first need to consider is who are the other people being impacted by the decision, okay? Who are the stakeholders? Who are the other people? Like if you're making a decision, who is going to have to deal with the consequences of that decision? Who might have input on that decision? We also have to think about who's our support network, who's going to support us when we're trying to look at data and encourage us to trust ourselves in our own analysis and our own thinking. On the flip side of that is, do we have a challenge network? Do we have people in our lives who really force us and stretch our thinking to ask us to think differently, who see the world differently? It's really helpful if you want to be a critical thinker to have a challenge network in your life. Okay. And as I already said before, it's being open-minded. I can teach you all the best problem solving and decision-making processes in the world, but if you don't have an open mind, those processes are going to be of little value. One of my favorite students, I love that she always appreciated when somebody did disagree with her. She loved having a challenge network. And her response was, it gives me a chance to learn something new every day when somebody sees something differently than I do. Is that how you think? Or do you react and close your mind when somebody has a different perspective? My surgeon was willing to open his mind think about the last time you really were willing to open your mind when it was a big decision, okay? Or a big, item in your life. A lot of times we don't want to do that. We also need to think about, where are we physically? Maslow's hierarchy of needs exists for a reason. If we are hungry, tired, we are not going to be as prepared to think critically. And that's physiological needs at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy. Okay. If we don't feel safe, we are not going to think as critically as we can. So every level in Maslow's hierarchy, the closer we are to self-actualization, number one, the more likely we're going to trust ourselves, and also probably more willing to be open-minded because we aren't worried about meeting our basic needs. Okay. So if you have to make a tough decision, most people would tell you, don't do it on an empty stomach or when you're really tired. Our brains just don't work as well in those situations. It's interesting because research actually now is proving that daydreaming is part of thinking critically. Our minds actually wander about 47% of the time we're awake. And so if we think we're already on focus, we're kidding ourselves because our minds do wander. It's kind of a default network that there's parts of our brain that actually they're trying to connect. The information is trying to get from the left brain to the right brain. And that connection sometimes takes us having downtime or daydreaming for those networks to actually connect. And so daydreaming is connected with our executive function, which is actually associated with the part of our brain that handles the most complex problem solving and decision-making processes. So the studies actually said that a healthy amount of daydreaming is actually connected to improved critical thinking capabilities. It's also been shown that daydreaming is dramatically more present in those who are actually considered to have superior intelligence. Now, who doesn't want to be able to hold that out? So when people make a comment that, it seems like you're daydreaming, well, throw that one at them. That you're actually practicing your superior intelligence. Okay. Now, if and when you show up at my course through CCAP, some of my critical thinking, making decisions that stick course, one of the first places we start is that to make better decisions. So we unpack critical thinking even more, but I give you 5 questions to make better decisions. Okay. We do a case study where we actually have to fire someone. And half the focus is, we're going through and people are making this decision to fire someone. And after we discuss the decisions, we unpack how they made that decision. Okay. And did they have, criteria, and were they understanding their thought processes, and were they transparent, and how can we do that more effectively? And we do that by focusing about half the course on number 3. And that is, what are some methods and tools you can actually use to be a better problem solver and decision maker? We address all 5 of these points during the course. If you can't wait for the course and you want to know how to write a good problem statement, because a well-defined problem is a half-solved problem, I did a webinar for CCAPS 6 years ago now on critical thinking and problem solving, and you can find that out on YouTube. So if you're just dying to find out how to write a good problem statement to get you heading in the right direction to thinking critically, engaging others, this is a great place to start. But again, join us for the class. Now, to think critically, one of the things that I've learned is that we are often more effective when we use structured processes. So in the course, we spend time learning about a force field analysis, affinity diagrams, we practice multi-voting, and we also do a decision matrix. Okay. I'm going to give you a really simple overview of what a decision matrix is today, just to give you a sense of how the tool is used and how it can help you think more critically. Okay. So what is going to be different today than the course is we're going to spend time talking about what I learned from my surgeon about the need to really figure out how do you, okay, use your head, your heart, and your gut like he did in making the decision, okay? And using structured processes will actually allow you to do that more effectively. And some of you might be like, yeah, I don't know. A lot of times we all have a preference maybe to use one way of thinking, but research has proven that we actually have three brains, okay? That we think of our mental brain, the one that's in our head, the one that we've always grown up being labeled our brain. But research has proven that we actually have three brains, that there is our heart and our gut, and there's information from our heart and our gut that is very relevant to every decision-making process. Now, naturally, most of us pick one or two of these that are our default mechanism, okay? Like it's not uncommon for certain people to rely more heavily on one of these than another. Like, an engineer might be more likely to pay attention to their head, okay? And it might be that, like I know my one daughter, she relies very much on her heart and a gut when she makes decisions. But we need to use all three and understand the value of using all three, that we aren't really being true to ourselves and we aren't thinking critically if we don't access all three, because they tend to have different functions in helping us think through things. Okay. So I want to make this a little more real for you. Okay. So I want this to become personal, but I'm going to give you a story that goes with this. But let's just assume that you have a difficult choice to make. And I built this case study around something that happened to me one time, is that I had a job I loved. And then all of a sudden, somehow or another, somebody had given my name to someone, and somebody, reaches out to me and it's like, man, we have this job for you. Okay. We think you'd be a really good candidate given what we know about you and your experience. And so all of a sudden, here I am faced with this decision, like here I have this job I like, but this one on paper looks really good. It could be my dream job. How do you make that decision? Okay. And the best way to make a decision is usually to start with your criteria, to really think about what is important to you. Okay. What is important to you? When you're trying to decide, do you stay in your current job? Do you take the new job? Maybe the salary and the benefits are about the same. Maybe you're happy in your current job. Maybe the commute is different. But you really have to step back and think about, what are your criteria? Okay. What's more important to you? And so I want you right now, just to make this real, is I want you to think about what your top 5 criteria might be if all of a sudden you were presented with another job. Okay. Some of you, it might be really easy because you're either ready for a change or you really love where you're at, but assume that on paper or just on first glance, they appeared fairly equally. What might be those 5 criteria? And if you'd be willing to put those in the chat, that would be awesome, because we are going to use that information in a little bit for an activity. So I'm going to give you a little bit to think about that. Top 5 criteria, post them in the chat. Now, as these hit the chat, I am going to encourage you to go back and look at what other people have posted, because it's going to be important information that we are going to go back to, because just scrolling through this, wow, there's a lot more than 5 options in there. I'm seeing things like challenge, flexibility, location, management, supervision, growth opportunity, commute, the company culture, work-life balance, flexibility, how challenging the work is, how meaningful it is, the benefits package, different things like that. So I've probably seen at least 10 or 15 criteria. And when you're making a decision, yes, it would be helpful maybe to list more than 5, but for the purposes of an online webinar, it's easier to make the point if you can limit it to 5 criteria. Okay. So everyone who has shared, thank you for sharing. I really appreciate that. Now, as I continue to speak, I'm asking you to multitask, which isn't necessarily the best thing to do when you're trying to think critically, but go through and look at the lists that other people have. Oh, I love that one. I just saw Tina added something about ethics. Yes, that's a good one. But go through the list and think about, now that you've seen some other items, what would be your criteria? Okay. Now we're going to unpack this using the 3 different brains, kind of your head, your heart, and your gut. And think about now, wow, this is just information. How is this really relevant, Nan, to the case study? Well, typically, most of us start with our head, not necessarily, like I said, but if you were presented with a job option, people might start with their head because we've probably been taught when it comes to work and at work to be rational, especially when we are making big decisions, okay? And when we're being rational, a lot of times we're focusing on big data and analytics, and we're probably told to check our emotions at the door and just focus on the data, okay? So that's often what happens in our life. Now, that's not necessarily thinking as critically as we could be, but there is that important component of thinking with your head. And part of that is thinking with your head is to look, of course, at data. And that's part of what we just put up there. You put down your initial data, and now you're doing some research, limited research based on what's in front of you, to think about what might be other criteria. You could have just gone online and looked for other options, and some of you might, just in order to add to the list. Oh, and I love to see the things that keep popping up on there. Self-motivation. Yeah. Little busy work. That's interesting. Okay. So we have to do some research. But if we're thinking critically, we also need to think about the stakeholders. Like in the chat function, who are your stakeholders? If you were making a decision about taking a new job, who else might you need to talk to about that? Okay, absolutely. You'd have to talk to your partner, your family. Okay, who else might you need to talk to? Yeah, your mentors, your friends, your coworkers, your financial planner. Absolutely. Okay. Okay. I think those are all important people that we need to talk to, because we need to think of this. We need to look at things from a broader perspective. As I said, it's a team sport, but sometimes these people are going to be impacted by that decision, either directly or indirectly. And it's important to engage them in the decision. You know, that was just like my surgeon. Okay. He wasn't just looking at this from his perspective. Okay, he was looking at this from my perspective, because he asked me why I wanted the surgery. And when I said it was about my kids, he paid attention to what I was saying. And this is the funny thing about critical thinking, is that especially when other people are part of the decision-making process, you really have to unpack what's in their head, heart, and gut in order to make sure they buy in and are committed to that decision. Okay, so now your challenge network or some of these other people may help you practice what's called the beginner's mindset. A beginner's mindset leads to being open-minded, because we go into every decision with kind of a framework, a way of thinking, our initial criteria. But a beginner's mindset is like, what else is out there? What haven't I thought of? How might I look at this completely differently? And that's why it's important to do the research, to talk to the other stakeholders, to have a challenge network, because they will help stretch your thinking. Now that you've looked at this list, and hopefully you've come up with your 5 criteria for a job, because I just want you to practice just using 5. Okay. Now, what I'd like you to do is to rank order them, like which is the most important to you, and that which is most important, give it a 5, and the one that is least important. Now, you will notice in the handout, you were given a decision matrix. Oh, and I just noticed. So you can scratch out what's there. You can write this on a scratch piece of paper. I put something on there and I just noticed a mistake where I have commute. I think I changed it in the other slides to travel. But it's just being clear about what your criteria are. And I also put this in the slides and put my ideas and concepts in there, because if somebody came in middle or they just printed out or shared the handout, it will hopefully make more sense this way. So feel free to cross out if you did print this, or just write it on a piece of paper. What are your top 5 criteria? Okay. And then what I'd like you to do is to think about how you would rank those, with 5 being your most important and 1 being your least important. If you don't have the handout, it's okay. All you have to do at this point is on a piece of paper, just write your top 5 criteria and rank order them. 5 most important, 1 least important. And you don't need to share with everyone in the chat. It's great that you're willing to share so people can see what we're doing. Again, I said that 5 is most important, 1 is least important. And there's a reason for numbering and ranking the way you do. And it'll make more sense when we continue on here. Okay. I think most of you are tracking, so I'm going to go ahead and move to the next slide. This is where I start talking about the heart and brain connection, okay? Because oftentimes when I look at your lists, a lot of those things are really typical of what we would list as it relates to our brain, our traditional brain, our logical brain. Okay. When we list things like salary and benefits and work-life balance, some of those, but some of those also relate to our heart. Like some of that work-life balance does relate to your heart because it speaks to your values. Okay. So like the people who put ethics in there as well, that speaks to your values. And so our criteria, if we're really honest with ourselves, it's not just data. It's also about our heart and what's important to us. Okay. And we have to think about what's important to us. So not only do our values creep into the defining of our criteria, I'm guessing if I had given you the same 5 criteria, you would have ranked them you all would have ranked them slightly differently. Okay. And we rank them differently because of our values. Okay, so when somebody ever tells you that their decisions are completely logical and they're unbiased, they're lying, okay? No decision is completely logical or unbiased because how we rank things, the criteria we choose is often based on our values. Okay. So I'm going to give you another quick story that relates to this. So I was brought in, a peer of mine, somebody I work with, worked for a consulting firm here in town, and they were working with a client, and the client was getting ready to transition their business, and they had spent the last year trying to transition the business, and it didn't go the way they had planned. And the consulting firm went back to them, ran some more numbers, and were basically like, okay, here are your options. You can either sell the whole business, you can try the transition plan again, you can bring in external people and rather than transitioning internal. And they ran all of these, and the business owner could not make a decision. And my friend reached out to me, and my comment was, well, did you ever ask him why he was stuck? Like, what did his heart tell him? And they were just kind of looked at me like, oh, but they went back to the client and they asked him, well, how do you really feel? What would you want to do? What does your heart telling you? And the individual basically came back and said, you want to know what? My heart's not in it. I don't have the energy to spend another year trying to make this happen. Okay. We don't really always remember this or understand this, but our heart can feel, think, and decide for itself. There are actually 40,000 neurons and a whole network of neurotransmitters with very specific functions, which make it a perfect extension of our brain. Okay. It's instinctive, it's automatic, it's kind of, mysterious as well. But if we're really being true to ourselves, we have to pay attention to that. Part of job satisfaction has to do with our values and what's important to us. There's a reason that organizations are different. We don't all fit in the same job and we don't all fit in the same organization. And we need to understand that when we're making these decisions. Okay. Now, I'm going to give you another story to make this point. So it's, as the co-host said today with me on the whole video, it's either Nan or nothing. You either get all of me or none of me with the whole slides thing. But the example for me is I just had a picture of a house up there. When the house I live in, when we were looking to move into the house, we had given our real estate agent a whole list of criteria. It was school district, price, commute to the airport. We wanted so many bedrooms and so many, a certain square footage, and we wanted a low maintenance exterior. We had this list of all our criteria. Well, let me just tell you, after an entire week of looking at houses, okay, and we had looked at over 47 houses. We were on a pre-transfer trip, and the pre-transfer trip was just about over, and we had worn our real estate agent slick. Okay. We were sitting in our office, not feeling like we had made a decision, and we see a picture of a house on her desk. And it's like, well, why didn't you show us that house? And she's like, well, it didn't meet any of your criteria, or very few of it. She says, it probably only met about half your criteria. And we're like, well, we've run out of houses. Why don't you just show us anyway? Okay. So she showed us the house, and we get into the house, and it looks very different internally than it did externally. And right away, I had kind of a reaction to the house. It didn't meet our criteria, and that it didn't have the right number of bedrooms. It didn't have the right number of garage stalls. It didn't have a low maintenance exterior because the house has a flat roof. Okay. But what the house did have was floor to ceiling windows looking at a natural pond on a wooded lot. Okay. With a view that really kind of sang to me. Okay. Now, I had never put on our criteria looking for a house that something would sing to me, but sometimes we know things. Okay. Now, some of that's part of your gut, but some of that's your feelings around what you value. Okay. So what even made this funnier is the person who was selling the house. She said to us, we were barely in the house. We toured it. She looked at us and she's like, well, you can stand naked in any room and nobody's going to know, and we're like, what? Like, why are you telling us this information? But that isn't a criteria I ever would have put on my list of things I was looking for in a house. But what it did remind me is that there are things that are intangible that we often forget. I mean, as our home is our safe space, our home is where we recharge. And, most of my friends who know me will say, I'm like a cat or a house plant. I need sunlight. I need windows. And there was something about when I walked in, it was like, wow, the nature and the light that came into the house was really important to me. And light is important to my mood. Okay. It wasn't a criteria, but if I really was true to who I am and thought about my values and what was important to me and my needs, it should have been a criteria. Okay. So let's go back and think about, are we really in touch with our feelings and our needs sometimes? when we are trying to make a decision, because those are things that are important to consider. They are also criteria. Okay. So now, for those of you who are brain people, you're like, well, how do I tap into my feelings? And should I be tapping into my feelings? Okay. Because as I said, some of us have been taught not to tap into our feelings. You know, in a former life, I used to be a bank regulator. We checked our feelings at the door when we went into the bank sometimes. That was just the way we were brought up. And so this can be a hard thing for some of us. Well, in order to be more comfortable tapping into our feelings when we are going to make a decision, we need to expand our emotional vocabulary. We need to be able to know, feel, and list different emotions. And then we need to pay attention to those emotions. Okay. Now, realistically, when we have an emotion, we actually have a physical reaction. Okay. You all know this when you've been put in a situation that sometimes you either tense up or you sweat or you flush, you know, you're like, ooh, you get that feeling, you know, kind of sometimes. And if we can start paying attention to those physical changes, more than likely that's our body trying to tell us we're experiencing an emotion. And in an ideal world, you should be able to start to identify what those triggers are and what emotions are related to them. Okay. That we are more likely to have the same reaction to fear or anger or frustration physiologically, okay, over a consistent period of time. Our physical reaction is very similar to that emotion. Now, having said that, it's going to be different for each of you. So I can't give you this nice little list. You kind of have to keep a mood journal to figure it out for yourselves. Okay. How do I feel today? And how does that make me feel physiologically? Where do I notice that emotion showing up? And just know that emotions are not a bad thing. All emotions, they're not good or bad. They just are. And it's our job. Yes. Thank you, Tina, is to accept the emotion without judgment. Okay. Because that's where we get messed up, is when we add the judgment, we can't think as critically, because we're blurred and we're putting judgment on it, and there really isn't. Now, we're going to do another quick activity, because what I find is that a lot of us don't know what our emotions are. So how can we even name our emotions and identify where they're coming from if we can't even articulate it? So I'd like you very quickly, if you would, get out a piece of paper again, or on your phone or on your laptop, on a Post-it, whatever. I am going to give you 1 minute to brainstorm emotions. Okay, 1 minute. And in that 1 minute, I want you to brainstorm as many emotions as possible. Okay, as many emotions as possible. Okay, so everyone ready? I'm going to go ahead and start my timer. And when I say go, you can start writing. And when I say stop, I'd like you to stop. And then let's see how many emotions you can come up with. So, hoping most of you are ready. If you want to go ahead and start. Okay, go ahead and stop. How many emotions did you come up with? Wow. What did I see? I think one of the first ones that popped up. I'm impressed. So a lot, yeah. Diana, she's got 20. I got a lot at line 19, 14, 10, 9, 8, 11, 41. Wow, I've never seen that happen. You actually wrote down 41. I'm really impressed. I don't even know who that is because they've got a number in there. I've never gotten that high of a number. Typically, when I do this activity, the number is typically less than 20. Most people get between 8 and probably 12 or 13. And so if you're looking at these people going, how the heck did you get such a high number? It's not easy, let me tell you. Okay. But if we can't name different emotions, we don't necessarily know the difference between those emotions and how they're impacting our decision making. And so we need to increase our emotional vocabulary. So whoever that was who had 43, okay, good for you. You've done your homework. Either that or you pulled up a nice grid on the internet. And please share that link because we'd all like it. But go on the internet and find a list of different emotions and think about, can you differentiate them in your body? Do you know the difference between when you feel frustrated and irritated? Okay. Because if you're frustrated, does that impact your ability to make a decision? And is the frustration because of the decision, or is the frustration because of something that happened earlier in the day? Okay. That's where knowing your feelings are important, because if it's something that happened earlier in the day, it might be blurring your thinking at the moment. And you need to be able to separate those. And that is not always an easy thing to do. Okay. So go back to your list. Okay. I'm just going to say, go back to your list, and you'll just see on mine visually, I added another item. Okay. And I just added one more item because I wanted you to think about, after I thought about the emotions, is there an item on there or something else that emotionally, something I value that I didn't include on the list? Might you add something? And might that change your ranking of the items based on tapping into your feelings? Okay. Now, I'll be honest, part of the reason we talk about criteria is, and I use criteria a lot when I'm working with groups and even individuals, because I've made my kids do this. I've done this with them. Even when they were younger, I didn't explain the whole process to them. But using criteria takes a big decision and turns it into a lot of little decisions. And sometimes it's easier to have discussions with other people who are impacted by the decision when you can talk through the smaller points, point by point, than the big decision. Okay. And that's why it's important to think about criteria. But go back to your list. Was your list really brain dominated? Might you want to change your list of 5 or 6 criteria because you needed to add something that from a feeling perspective you had been missing that was important? Now, the last is to think about kind of that gut brain axis that, I think back to the story that my surgeon, and I talk about the surgeon, he said to me, something in my gut feels off. He said, I can't tell you why it feels different today than it did 2 months ago. Okay. There was just something different. For all of us, there's a high level of uncertainty. Yeah, the wheel of emotions. Yeah. There's a high level of uncertainty, as I said, with all our decisions. And with this surgery, there were a lot of risks, some known and unknown. But what he said to me when we had our conversation was that a slip of the knife could have resulted in me being paralyzed or dead. And he had heard me say that the most important thing in my life was my kids. That was the feeling part. Okay. He heard my feelings, but he also trusted his gut when he woke up the day before the surgery that something felt off, even if he couldn't articulate it. Okay. Now, the easiest way for me to think about this is I'm a visual person, and maybe visual or not, but how many of you have ever had troubles finding anything on your hard drive of your computer? I mean, even with the search function, sometimes I'm like, whoa, I'm like typing things in, trying to find out, what was the name I called it, or even if I have the name, I just can't find things. That's what our gut is to our brain. Our gut is telling us that there is a piece of information that is missing that we can't necessarily articulate, especially at the moment. Okay. So our job is to think about, how do we slow down? Okay. Yes. Thank you for the book suggestion. So good book. I've not read through the whole book, but I have heard of and referenced that a few times, some of Tara's work. So if you're listening to your gut, part of what you might have to do, yes, Brene Brown's new book is also awesome, is slow down, breathe, find quiet, and actually force a choice. And I'm going to show you how to do that in a minute. But know that critical thinking isn't just about logic in the brain. More and more research is pointing that our gut is our second brain, that our gut feelings really do mean something. That in this case, our brains have like 100 billion neurons, but our gut has 500 million neurons connected to our brain. So that was also, with the house, there was kind of a gut feeling when I walked into it. Okay. There was a little bit of a gut feeling when I walked into it. Now, I also think about that story, the case study that we're doing. Okay. So let's look at that. Now, if you rank ordered your item and you really thought about, if you had to pick which one best met each criteria, okay, you might say, the new job, going to make more money. So yeah, I put if I rank that 5, I put the 5 under the new job category. In my case, I didn't want to have to travel as much when this job was given to, presented to me. I already had a small child, she was like 2.5 at the time. And, we're thinking of having another kid, and I was traveling over 50% of the time. So I'm like, yeah, less travel. The new job would have more promotion potential, because in the last job, the only way I was going to get a promotion was if I moved. So I went through, but if you can see, what I did is I chose which option best met that criteria and took the importance of that criteria and moved it into that column. And then I added those columns, and so if that's all you do, okay, just using, and we go through a much more complex case in the course, but from a very simple perspective, using a decision matrix like this, it would say you should take the new job. Okay. Would tell you should take the new job. Now, the tricky part about this, and I'm just going to, take my screen off again and stop sharing a little bit, is that this was so my life, because when I had to make this decision, about my own jobs, and this is where the gut came in, on paper, it was my dream job, but something in my gut kept telling me, I don't know. It took me a month to tell the company that asked me to, were interested in me for this job, to say yes. I mean, I'd interviewed, they offered me the job, and it took me a month because I wasn't listening to my gut. Okay. And I took the job, and it became very apparent very quickly that it wasn't the right fit for me, because I hadn't paid attention to my feelings and my gut reaction. One of the things that our gut tells us is that sometimes we don't hear or accept data that's been presented to us. And when I was offered the job and I took the job, what I forgot and didn't pay attention to is they also had said, well, Nan, way back, but I hadn't really listened, is that I was going to be, I think, the 5th training officer I was going to be the 4th training officer in less than 6 years. Okay. Ding, 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 ding. Something should have been like, hello, why the high turnover? But all I saw was the perfect job on paper. Okay. I wasn't listening to all the information, and something in my gut wasn't really being connected to. And so it's really important that we pay attention to all of these. And when you use a grid like this, when you have something that comes up with a higher number, sorry, that's my bad. When you have a higher number like that, look at it. What is your gut telling you? Just because the new job got the higher score doesn't mean you have to follow that. What's your gut reaction to that? And is your gut reaction different than it was when the new job was presented to you, now that you've tried to sort through some data, both using all three brains? But it's okay to step back and go, what criteria have I forgot? What else haven't I considered? Okay. So just know that if you aren't trusting your gut, we need to get into the practice of doing it more. So maybe just think about a time that you didn't trust your gut. Why didn't you? What was the feeling? What was the emotional reaction? Just like with other feelings, we do have physical reactions from a gut instinct. Okay. So my hope is that today you maybe are thinking about critical thinking a little bit differently, understanding that, it is using our mind, our heart, and a gut is a skill. Okay. It takes practice to use all three. And the best way to think critically is to figure out how to hone your ability to access all three and know the times you are not going to get it right. Okay. That you are going to trust your gut or your heart or your brain, and it's going to lead you astray, but keep a record of how you do on all your decisions, and eventually you'll get better. But allowing yourself to trust all three will help you think more critically, especially if you're engaging other people. They are more likely to commit to the decision and stick with the decision if you've really thought critically from all perspectives. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your participation. I think we have a couple of minutes for questions.
Yes, thank you, Nan. So we'll move on to our question portion of the webinar. So if folks have any questions, please use the Q&A feature to add in your questions, and then I'll pass those on to Nan. So our first question here is, have you noticed a change in the criteria and ranking since COVID in regards to deciding between jobs?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when you think about it, haven't your values shifted?
Yeah,
and that's part of thinking critically, is tapping into our values and our feelings and our beliefs, and know that they change over time. They change over time. So how are you different than before COVID?
Yeah, I think definitely work-life balance, for sure. That made a big difference now, where it's more important these days.
Yeah, once we've experienced it, we don't want to go back. Or
Yeah.
some people are like, I can't wait to go back because I didn't have any work-life balance when I was trying to work at home.
Absolutely. So our next question is, what's the difference between instinct and intuition?
The difference between instinct and intuition is they're not necessarily, they're not truly separate. They usually align, and I think I had this in my slides, is that when you talk about these, they often relate, one, like instinct to the heart and intuition to the gut. And they're very similar, that intuition is like, you just know what the answer is. There's like this gut reaction. That's why they call it a gut reaction, where an instinct is more of an inkling, a feeling. That's that physiological feeling that I was speaking to, where that intuition is just a sense of a right or wrong. This is where we tend to move more into that fight or flight type of mentality, where the instinct is a feeling.
Mm-hmm. Awesome, thank you. So that will lead us into our next one. When heart, gut, and mind have conflicting opinions, how do you decide which to give more importance to?
Well, that's your work. There's no right or wrong answer to this. That's your work. Part of it is that's what you're doing in the rank ordering, is if you are keeping a mood journal, if you are keeping a decision-making journal, which one are you better with? Okay, which one are you more likely to be led astray by? Okay, like, I'll be honest, I don't trust my gut enough sometimes. I don't trust my feelings enough sometimes. And so I have to push myself out of my comfort zone to trust those more. And you are the only one who can decide how you create balance to using all three by figuring out which one you over rely on.
Mhm. Okay, how can you differentiate between insecurity, double guessing, and gut feeling?
Insecurity, we all have that. Okay. And that's part of the reason I encourage you to practice using all of these. That part of the reason some of us don't trust either our intellect or we don't trust our heart is that we are insecure, because either we've been told not to trust those things, or we made one or two big decisions using one or the other, and it didn't work out very well. And so we don't trust ourselves. And that's why I made the comment about feelings earlier, is the feeling you are having at the time of the decision, is it the decision that's driving the feeling, or is it an experience that happened sometime in the past that's driving that feeling? And it's a hard thing, because I'll be honest, we all have steamer trunks of baggage that come with us from life. And part of our job is to unpack those bags so that we can put new feelings, beliefs, and knowledge into them.
Okay, awesome. Let's see, we have some coming in here. Do you have any tips for the challenge that we face today of having information overload? Is this relying on gut?
Information overload is such a real thing, And I fall prey to it just like anyone else. I go through what I refer to as a binging and purging process, or I wallow around, I collect information, and I lose so much time wallowing, analyzing information. And there is value in that. But as you're wallowing in that information and looking at it, what are those feelings and reactions that are coming up? Do you build that into the process? And it's really easy for me, like I said, to turn that off. Okay. Or want to turn that off. So it's important to, yes, use data and learn how to be an effective researcher. That is a skill, but limit the amount of information and the amount. What happens is we do an disproportionate amount of time on that.
So that actually leads into our next one. Do you have a good source of research and application on the three brains that you suggest?
Well, there's all kinds of good information out there. I guess I should have thought of that, to have a book on hand or data. I think if you just type that in and Google that, there's all kinds of great information. Like, I can't even, of course, because I'm doing this, I'm having a brain blip right now, but there's an individual who does a lot of research on, he has a podcast, and I can't think of it at the name, Himmerman, and I can't think of it at the moment, but email me and I can get you some links, because I have links. Normally I just do a lot of research. The Harvard Business Review is a great place. There's some psychology sources that have information on this, but there's a gentleman who does a lot of podcasting now, and I just can't think of his name, where I got a lot of my research.
Okay, yeah, I believe a few folks shared some good resources in the chat as well.
Thank you.
And so that will be our last question. So I apologize to anyone who I wasn't able to get to your question. If you could go to the next slide, Nan.
Oh, sorry.
All right. So thank you again for your incredible useful information. It's been a pleasure having you here. I mentioned earlier, we'll send a link to the webinar recording within a week of today's webinar. If you enjoyed this webinar and want to dive deeper into this topic, there is a list of upcoming courses on the slide, as well as the college's contact information if you'd like to learn more information. And that last course there, Nan herself actually teaches that course. So if you're interested in that, please feel free to sign up for that. And I just want to thank you all for joining us today, and have a wonderful and safe afternoon.